Welcome to our study today. I'm absolutely delighted to guide you through this deep dive explainer on Exodus chapter 4. We're going to be tracing Moses' incredible journey, literally going from revelation to readiness, and we'll be analyzing the text using a strict literal, grammatical, and historical framework. Now, you might be wondering, why is this chapter so incredibly vital? Well, it's because here is where we see the true anatomy of a divine calling. We so often focus on the burning bush back in chapter 3, right? But chapter 4 is where the rubber really meets the road. It's where human frailty smashes right into divine authority. By focusing on the structural flow, the deep historical context, and the profound theological truths embedded right here in God's Word, we can really grasp exactly how the Lord equips His sent servant. So let's dive into this magnificent chapter together. Here is a quick look at our syllabus for today's session. We've structured this study into 5 focused sections. First up, we'll establish the historical and cultural background. Second, we're going to walk sequentially right through the biblical narrative. Third, we'll unpack the theological significance. Fourth, we'll draw out the spiritual lessons and application. And finally, we'll bring our study to a formal conclusion. Let us examine the historical and cultural background. To really properly understand Exodus 4, we first have to anchor ourselves in the correct dispensational context. You see, the events of this magnificent chapter occur right at the tail end of the dispensation of promise, an era that actually began centuries prior with the foundational Abrahamic covenant. At this very moment, God is actively preparing to transition national Israel toward an entirely new era. These profound signs given to Moses here in 1446 BC are happening just before the monumental Sinai legislation is enacted. It's like we're watching the hinge of redemptive history turning right in front of us, moving from the patriarchal promises directly toward the dispensation of law. Understanding this timeline is absolutely essential, folks, because God isn't just delivering a group of slaves here. He is actively forming a designated covenantal nation. Now, it's fascinating how God intentionally uses ordinary, everyday cultural elements to systematically dismantle Egyptian pharaonic authority. Just think about the staff. This is a common shepherd's tool, right? But it transforms into a serpent. To the Egyptian mind, this directly confronts the uraeus, that rearing cobra that adorned the pharaoh's crowns. The Egyptians actually believed that cobra would literally spit fire at the pharaoh's enemies. But God's serpent, it easily overpowers their ultimate symbol of might. Then there's the second sign, a leprous hand. This touches on a really deep cultural fear of skin disease and ritual uncleanness, brilliantly demonstrating God's total, absolute sovereignty over purity and defilement. And finally, turning the Nile water to blood. This confronts Egypt's revered lifeline. The Nile was quite literally personified as a god in their cultic religious imagination. By turning it to blood, God is validating his messenger by proving his absolute, undeniable supremacy over Egypt's false gods. Now, family structures and covenantal practices provide the essential social framework of our chapter. Before we encounter a rather cryptic and sobering event later in the narrative, we really need to strictly define circumcision as a covenant sign. Ever since Genesis 17, this was the mandated outward mark of belonging to the Abrahamic covenant. Neglecting this sign, well, it meant being entirely cut off from God's people. It was an act of complete severance. This severe theological weight of covenantal obedience is absolutely crucial to understanding God's unbending standards for the people he calls to leadership. Listen, grace does not negate the necessity of holiness, especially in the private life of God's chosen vessels. Let us examine the biblical narratives. The chapter opens with some fresh and, honestly, incredibly relatable doubts. Moses voices a lingering human hesitation. As we read here in Exodus 4 verse 1, quote, Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you,'" NIV. This completely exposes a deeply common human pattern. We have to realize that even after the sheer majesty of God's self-revelation at the burning bush, even after standing barefoot on holy ground, the human heart can still drastically falter at the daunting prospect of public obedience. Moses is essentially asking, what if my audience completely rejects the message? And let's be honest, that's a fear that plagues nearly every servant of God. In response to that fear, God doesn't just offer mere philosophy or abstract theological comfort. He provides validating signs that sequentially escalate in power. First, the shepherd's staff turns to a serpent and back, which teaches Moses that God can entirely dominate physical danger. Second, his hand becomes leprous white and is miraculously restored, proving God can instantly reverse profound corruption. Third, God promises that Nile water, when poured out on dry ground, will literally become blood. Notice how these signs purposefully escalate, both chronologically and in magnitude. They go from a personal, private demonstration with the staff in hand all the way up to a devastating public, environmental judgment with the river. God is thoroughly, completely equipping his servant with undeniable proof of divine backing. But, despite these incredible pledges of power, Moses' misgivings only seem to deepen. He pleads that he lacks eloquence and is slow of speech. Maybe he's fearing the highly polished rhetoric of the royal Egyptian court. God replies with sovereign clarity in Exodus 4 verse 11, quote, "The Lord said to him, 'Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord?'" NIV. The absolute crucial point here is that a messenger's adequacy comes entirely from divine provision, not from natural human eloquence. After all, the God who actually formed the mouth is more than capable of governing it. He doesn't call the equipped, he unequivocally equips the called. The narrative wrestles even further with a messenger's adequacy. Moses ultimately just begs God to send someone else. And at this outright resistance, the Lord's anger rightfully burns. Yet, in his astonishing mercy, what does he do? He provides Aaron. God establishes a specific relational structure for the mission ahead. Moses will stand as God to Aaron, while Aaron will serve as the delegated mouthpiece. This arrangement brilliantly rescues Moses from his paralyzing fear while simultaneously protecting him from future pride by forcing him to share the stage. It is such a beautiful early glimpse of shared ministry, ensuring that the power remains anchored entirely in God's authority rather than resting on the charisma of one single man. Let us examine the theological significance. As we transition into doctrine, we really need to carefully weave these systematic theology classifications into our study, because Exodus 4 lays some truly profound groundwork. In Christology, which is the study of Christ, the firstborn son motif points us directly to the promised Messiah. In Harmatology, the study of sin, we see a prime example of human depravity and Pharaoh's rebellion and his hardened heart. In soteriology, our doctrine of salvation, the blood poured on dry ground heavily foreshadows the atoning Passover blood that will ultimately shield from divine wrath. And in ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, we observe a foundational early pattern of shared leadership and diverse gifts working together to serve one unified mission. Literally every branch of theology finds rich soil right here in this text. Now, a cornerstone of sound, conservative biblical study is maintaining the strict theological distinction between God's earthly program for national Israel and his distinct spiritual program for the church. National Israel is God's chosen physical nation, specifically called out of Egypt as his firstborn son for a distinct priestly service on earth, governed by specific covenants and geographic promises. The New Testament church, on the other hand, is a completely separate, distinct spiritual body born much later at Pentecost. Yet despite this absolutely crucial dispensational distinction, the church later learns profoundly from this very chapter. We get to glean the timeless wisdom of shared leadership and the employment of diverse spiritual gifts for a unified, God-glorifying mission. Let's look a bit closer at the Christology of this chapter regarding prophetic fulfillment, specifically that sonship motif. The profound declaration to Pharaoh, "Israel is my firstborn son," possesses a glorious dual layer. On one side, we have the immediate historical fulfillment. National Israel is literally and physically called out of the bondage of Egypt, an event confirmed prophetically in Hosea 11:1. But on the other side, we have the ultimate prophetic fulfillment. Jesus Christ, the beloved Son of God, perfectly embodies the nation and fulfills its righteous calling. Christ himself takes refuge in Egypt and is subsequently called out of it, as Matthew 2:15 beautifully reveals. Christ succeeds exactly where the nation of Israel failed. It's just incredible to see it unfold. Under the category of hamartology, the study of sin, we encounter the complex hardening of Pharaoh's heart. God announces he will harden Pharaoh's heart before the confrontation even unfolds. Now, this is a profound, layered mystery, holding together absolute divine sovereignty and willful human stubbornness. The biblical text unequivocally affirms Pharaoh's deep moral responsibility. He actively hardened his own heart against the truth. Yet it equally affirms God's sovereign overruling of that rebellion to rightfully display his holy name in all the earth. We have to humbly honor the restraint of Scripture here, resting quietly in the absolute steadiness that human opposition never, under any circumstance, derails God's ultimate redemptive plan. Let us examine the spiritual lessons and application. Theology must always transform our walk, moving from the head directly down to the heart. First, notice that God so often starts with what is already right there in our hands. An ordinary, weathered shepherd's staff became a divine instrument of remarkable deliverance. Second, your weakness is never a veto when God sends you. Our perceived limits are precisely what ensure our reliance rests entirely on His Spirit. Third, shared service protects both the message and the messenger. Plurality in ministry completely guards against the twin dangers of pride and despair. And finally, deliverance must always lead to adoration, not self-display. These miraculous signs are not spectacles for human entertainment. They're divine pointers to the God who calls us to worship.
This brings us to a stark, really searching question. Does your private obedience keep pace with your public calling? Think about it. During Moses' journey back to Egypt, a severe and sudden interruption occurs at a lodging place where the Lord nearly takes his life. This shocking crisis was due to uncircumcision in his family, a direct violation of the Abrahamic covenant. Zipporah's swift, obedient action resolves the deadly breach. The profound warning here is that neglect of covenant holiness in the home can completely choke a ministry at its very birth. The God who calls us to public service demands for sure that our private house walks faithfully in his holy ways.
Let us examine the conclusion. Exodus 4 brilliantly brings us all the way from the burning fire of Horeb to the unified belief of the elders of Israel. We read in the closing verse, Exodus 4:31, quote, "And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped." NIV. This beautifully summarizes the massive theological and emotional weight of the entire chapter. Moses' deep-seated fear was answered with validating signs, his stubborn reluctance was met with a faithful partner, and his covenantal neglect was corrected with swift obedience. And the beautiful intended result of all this divine preparation is that true belief ultimately bends into reverent, awe-filled worship. Moses literally went from arguing with God in the quiet desert to leading an entire nation in worship. So the question for us today is this: what ordinary thing is God asking you to pick up, and what lingering excuses do you need to finally lay down? May the Lord richly bless your continued study of His perfect word, granting you the courage to take up whatever's in your hand, trust the one who is always with you, and walk forward for the sake of His glorious name. For more in-depth studies, visit the Grace and Knowledge series blog at woodybrohm.online.